guilty or not guilty. A roll call vote is required. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Abraham. Guilty. Mr. Abraham, guilty. Mr. Akaka. Mr. Akaka, not guilty. Mr. Allard. Mr. Allard, guilty. Mr. Ashcroft. Guilty. Mr. Ashcroft, guilty. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, not guilty. Mr. Bai. Not guilty. Mr. Bai, not guilty. Mr. Bennett. Guilty. Mr. Bennett, guilty. Mr. Biden. Mr. Biden, not guilty. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Bingaman, not guilty. Mr. Bond. Mr. Bond, guilty. Mrs. Boxer.
Not guilty.
Mrs. Boxer, not guilty. Mr. Breaux. Mr. Breaux, not guilty. Mr. Brownback. Mr. Brownback, guilty. Mr. Bryan. Mr. Bryan, not guilty. Mr. Bunning. Mr. Bunning, guilty. Mr. Burns. Guilty. Mr. Burns, guilty. Mr. Byrd. Mr. Byrd, not guilty. Mr. Campbell. Mr. Campbell, guilty. Mr. Chafee. Mr. Chafee, not guilty. Mr. Cleland. Mr. Cleland, not guilty. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, guilty. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, not guilty. Mr. Conrad. Not guilty. Mr. Conrad, not guilty. Mr. Coverdale. Mr. Coverdale, guilty. Mr. Craig. Mr. Craig, guilty. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, guilty. Mr. Daschle. Mr. Daschle, not guilty. Mr. DeWine. Mr. DeWine, guilty. Mr. Dodd. Mr. Dodd, not guilty. Mr. Domenici. Mr. Domenici, guilty. Mr. Dorgan. Mr. Dorgan, not guilty. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, not guilty. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards, not guilty. Mr. Enzi. Guilty. Mr. Enzi, guilty. Mr. Feingold. Mr. Feingold, not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, not guilty. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald, guilty. Mr. Frist. Mr. Frist, guilty. Mr. Gorton. Mr. Gorton, not guilty. Mr. Graham of Florida. Mr. Graham of Florida, not guilty. Mr. Graham of Texas. Mr. Graham of Texas, guilty. Mr. Grahams of Minnesota. Mr. Grahams of Minnesota, guilty. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, guilty. Mr. Gregg. Mr. Gregg, guilty. Mr. Hagel. Mr. Hagel, guilty. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, not guilty. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, guilty. Mr. Helms. Mr. Helms, guilty. Mr. Hollings. Mr. Hollings, not guilty. Mr. Hutchinson of Arkansas. Mr. Hutchinson of Arkansas, guilty. Mrs. Hutchison of Texas. Mrs. Hutchison of Texas, guilty. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, guilty. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Inouye, not guilty. Mr. Jeffords. Mr. Jeffords, not guilty. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, not guilty. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, not guilty. Mr. Kerry of Nebraska. Mr. Kerry of Nebraska, not guilty. Mr. Kerry of Massachusetts. Mr. Kerry of Massachusetts, not guilty. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, not guilty. Mr. Kyle. Mr. Kyle, guilty. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu, not guilty. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Lautenberg, not guilty. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, not guilty. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, not guilty. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lieberman, not guilty. Mrs. Lincoln.
Not guilty.
Mrs. Lincoln, not guilty. Mr. Lott.
Guilty.
Mr. Lott, guilty. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Lugar, guilty. Mr. Mack. Mr. Mack, guilty. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain, guilty. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, guilty. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski, not guilty. Mr. Moynihan. Mr. Moynihan, not guilty. Mr. Murkowski. Mr. Murkowski, guilty. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, not guilty. Mr. Nichols. Mr. Nichols, guilty. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island.
Not guilty.
Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, not guilty. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Reed of Nevada, not guilty. Mr. Robb. Mr. Robb, not guilty. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, guilty. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, not guilty. Mr. Roth. Mr. Roth, guilty. Mr. Santorum. Mr. Santorum, guilty. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes, not guilty. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, not guilty. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions, guilty. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, not guilty. Mr. Smith of New Hampshire. Mr. Smith of New Hampshire, guilty. Mr. Smith of Oregon. Mr. Smith of Oregon, guilty. Ms. Snow. Ms. Snow, not guilty. Mr. Spector. Mr. Stevens. Mr. Stevens, not guilty. Mr. Thomas. Mr. Thomas, guilty. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson, not guilty. Mr. Thurmond. Mr. Guilty.
He's found there, and our photojournalist Greg Bonds told us just a few minutes ago the bodies were discovered and maybe have been there for several days. Our reporter Jeff Lee is on the scene right now, and Jeff, what can you tell us about this?
Well, it's still a very active scene. As you can see behind me, the apartment complex has been cordoned off. Just over here, Andy Phillips is giving a press conference. We'll see if we can sneak in on here and hear some more details about the possible homicide, about bodies found in an apartment.
6 this morning.
Someone said they heard gunshots Tuesday night. Is that, do you think it happened Tuesday?
No, we don't think it went back that far. No.
What
Is it methodical?
The shooter, Andy, at this point?
He's the father of the children. As far as we know, he was living in Oklahoma City. The mother of the children came here to live with her sister at this address. We don't know why, but apparently they had separated at that point. The information we have is that he came over to pick the children up, and then this incident occurred.
Have you had time to run a check on him? Any other criminal background that you know of?
No, we don't, and we can't release that right now.
Right now, we're getting some information about some of the possible victims, about some of the players in this. We do hear that there are as many as 6 victims, and right now they're trying to determine how whether this is a murder or a suicide or joint thing. As Greg Bond said earlier, that there was a witness that heard shots here as early as Tuesday, but Andy Phillips saying that they don't think that it happened that far back. So a lot of questions that need to be answered here in North Tulsa. Back to you, Mark.
But Jeff, once again, we're hearing that there were 6 bodies found, 3 children, 3 adults.
That's about what we're hearing right now. And again, they're just trying to assimilate all this information. The scene here is multiple police officers, detectives, even Chief Palmer here is on the scene. Behind me, what you can't see are numerous neighbors around here that are still in shock. Just a few minutes ago, we saw a woman that was just wailing. We believe that she may have been a relative of some of the victims. Back to you, Mark.
Well, it's my guess the police are trying to find out more about this as we are at this time, right?
Yeah, and as soon as this press conference is done, we'll have some more information. We'll try to pass that along as soon as we can.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. Let's head back to Washington, D.C. right now, where the historic vote is going on in the Senate.
Special report from Oklahoma's News 8. Coverage you can count on.
Mr. Smith of New Hampshire. Mr. Smith of New Hampshire, guilty. Mr. Smith of Oregon. Mr. Smith of Oregon, guilty. Ms. Snow. Ms. Snow, not guilty. Mr. Spector. Mr. Spector, not guilty. Mr. Stevens. Mr. Stevens, guilty. Mr. Thomas. Mr. Thomas, guilty. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson, guilty. Mr. Thurmond. Mr. Thurmond, guilty. Mr. Torricelli. Mr. Torricelli, not guilty. Mr. Voinovich. Mr. Voinovich, guilty. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, guilty. Mr. Wellstone. Mr. Wellstone, not guilty. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, not guilty.
So on Article 2, obstruction of justice, you can see the totals there. Absolutely right down the middle. Democrats 45, and the 5 Republicans were Senator Chafee of Rhode Island, Senator Collins of Maine, Senator Jeffers of Vermont, Senator Snow of Maine, and Senator Spector of Pennsylvania, who says not proven, but is judged as not guilty in this case.
On this article of impeachment, 50 senators have pronounced William Jefferson Clinton, President of the United States, guilty as charged. 50 senators have pronounced him not guilty. 2/3 of the senators present not having pronounced him guilty, the Senate adjudges that the respondent, William Jefferson Clinton, President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the second article of impeachment. The chair directs judgment to be entered in accordance with the judgment of the Senate as follows. The Senate, having tried William Jefferson Clinton, President of the United States, upon 2 articles of impeachment exhibited against him by the House of Representatives, and 2/3 of the senators present not having found him guilty of the charges contained therein, it is therefore ordered and adjudged that the said William Jefferson Clinton be, and he hereby is, acquitted of the charges in the said articles. The chair recognizes the majority leader.
Mr. Chief Justice, there's an order at the desk.
The clerk will read the order.
Ordered that the Secretary be directed to communicate to the Secretary of State, as provided by Rule 23 of the Rules of Procedure and Practice in the Senate when sitting on impeachment trials, and also to the House of Representatives, the judgment of the Senate in the case of William Jefferson Clinton, and transmit a certified copy of the judgment to each.
Without objection, the order will be entered. The chair wishes to make a brief statement without objection, I trust. More than a month ago, I first came here to preside over the Senate sitting as a court of impeachment. I was a stranger to the great majority of you. I underwent the sort of culture shock that naturally occurs when one moves from the very structured environment of the Supreme Court to what I shall call, for want of a better phrase, the more free-form environment of the Senate. I leave you now a wiser but not a sadder man. I have been impressed by the manner in which the majority leader and the minority leader have agreed on procedural rules in spite of the differences that separate their two parties on matters of substance. I have been impressed by the quality of the debate in closed session on the entire question of impeachment as provided for in the Constitution. Agreed upon procedures for airing substantive divisions must be the hallmark of any great deliberative body. Our work as a court of impeachment is now done. I leave you with the hope that our several paths may cross again under happier circumstances. The majority leader.
Mr. Chief Justice, we thank you for your comments, and I send a resolution to the desk.
The clerk will read the resolution.
Senate Resolution 37. To express gratitude for the service of the Chief Justice of the United States as presiding officer during the impeachment trial.
Mr. Chief Justice, I ask that it be considered as having been read in its entirety.
The clerk, without objection, will read it in its entirety.
And I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of S-Res 37, introduced earlier today by Senator Lott and Senator Daschle, and that the resolution be adopted.
Without objection, the resolution is adopted.
I ask unanimous consent that the resolution be agreed to and the motion to reconsider be laid upon the table, and any statements that senators wish to make on this be printed at this point in the record. Now, Mr. Chief Justice.
Without objection, it's so ordered.
On behalf of myself and the entire United States Senate, we want to offer you our thanks and the gratitude of the American people for your service to the nation and throughout this impeachment court to this institution. As our presiding officer, during most of the last 5 weeks, you have brought to our proceedings a gentle dignity and an unfailing sense of purpose and sometimes a sense of humor. The majority leader realized when it was time to take a break and not to take a break when the Chief Justice said, let's go forward. By placing duty above personal convenience and many other considerations, you've taught a lesson in leadership. Your presence in the chair, the President of the Senate, following the directives of our Constitution, gave comity to this chamber and assurance to the nation. I would like to close with our traditional Mississippi parting. Y'all come back soon. but I hope that's not taken the wrong way, and not for an occasion like this one. So instead, as you return to your work on the court in the great marble temple of the law right across the lawn from this Capitol, we salute you, sir, with renewed appreciation and esteem for a good friend and good neighbor. And now, Mr. Chief Justice, if the Democratic leader would join you, we have a small token of our appreciation. We have a tradition in the Senate that after you've presided over the Senate for 100 hours, we present you with the Golden Gavel Award. And I'm not sure it quite reached 100 hours, but it's close enough.
Real heartfelt appreciation for the Chief Justice, who said of himself that he was a stranger when he came to preside over this impeachment trial, that he had some culture shock. Anybody mingling with 100 senators is bound to have culture shock. He left a wiser but not a sadder man.
Mr. Chief Justice, I ask unanimous consent that the February 5th, 1999 affidavit of Mr. Christopher Hitchens and the February 7th, 1999 affidavit of Ms. Carol Blue and the affidavit of Mr. R. Scott Armstrong be admitted into evidence in this proceeding, and that the full written transcripts of the depositions taken pursuant to S. Res. 30 be included in the public record of the trial at this point. This matter has been cleared on both sides of the aisle.
Without objection, it's so ordered.
And now, Mr. Chief Justice, I move that the Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment on the articles exhibited against William Jefferson Clinton, adjourn sine die.
Without objection, the motion is agreed to. The Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment, stands adjourned sine die.
And the escorts will go to the podium to escort the Chief Justice from the chamber.
Well, 5 weeks since it began, and you may recall, if you were with us at the outset, when those doors opened in the Senate and Chief Justice Rehnquist, Chief Justice of the United States, came in, the observations at the time were that the senators were all somewhat intimidated by his arrival, looking as grand as he did then and does now in his black robe with his own designed chevrons on the sleeve. And just to repeat briefly what he said himself a moment ago, that he leaves not sadder rather, but wiser, impressed with the quality of debate, particularly, he said, in the closed session. You know that throughout these 5 weeks the Senate has often adjourned to the old Senate chamber to have private debate, and at least in the early stages, though this ended on a very particularly party note, there was some considerable admiration, and not to mention self-congratulation, for the bipartisan nature of the debate in closed session. And Senator Lott indulging himself in a little Mississippi jargon there, y'all come back soon, but not under such circumstances. And as they leave and the Senate no longer sits as a court, just want to clarify one very quickly, perhaps at the end here, asking Cokie Roberts, because it may have thrown people at home when Senator Lott asked that some testimony by Christopher Hitchens, his wife Blue, and Scott Armstrong be entered into this case. Cokie, bring us up to date very quickly on what that's about.
Well, throughout the last few days of this trial, these were affidavits filed saying that Sidney Blumenthal, the president's aide, had told these three journalists, or told two of them, and the third had heard it from the original two contemporaneously, that the president had called Monica Lewinsky a stalker, and Sidney Blumenthal passed on that story to these journalists. He has said under oath that he did not do that. At various times in the last few days, the Republicans have tried to enter these affidavits into evidence. The Democrats have objected. Now that the trial is over, the president has been found not guilty. They are now part of the record. The
perfect senatorial political solution. The notion was that these statements by Mr. Blumenthal contributed to the president's obstructing of justice in the Lewinsky affair. The very easiest thing I think to do at the moment is, and perhaps I hope the most constructive, is to just wander around this group for a moment, starting with you, George. We've watched this for 5 weeks. We've watched and been engaged in it for many months. What are you thinking?
Well, what I'm thinking today was I was struck by what the Chief Justice said, that he's leaving this a wiser but not a sadder man. And I wonder if he was trying to put a seal of approval over the way the Senate dealt with this process, and perhaps a little bit of a wink, saying that they reached the right decision. I think they probably did, but as Bill Kristol said earlier, the debate over whether this was right or wrong and the length is not going to go away.
Well, let me go to Bill Kristol next, Bill, because I'm struck by what you said this morning. It's over, but it's not over. Your thoughts right now?
My though's still that it's over, but it's not over. If Vice President Gore is the Democratic nominee in 2000, I just don't see how the judgment of Bill Clinton doesn't become fundamental to the presidential election of 2000. And if Mrs. Clinton runs for the Senate in New York, which seems to be increasingly rumored, there's an even more vivid reminder of her husband's presidency on the ballot in 2000. I do think lots of cultural issues, lots of social issues, lots of everything ranging from the independent counsel law to sexual harassment law to the relationship of public and private, all of these issues that were raised by the events of the last year aren't going away and will continue to be debated.
I'm going to resist for a second coming back to that notion of Mrs. Clinton running for the Senate in New York, and resist the temptation to stomp on it as anything more than a rumor at the moment. Let's stay with the point, Sam Donaldson at the White House, the president's impeachment trial.
Well, Peter, I can't help remember the conversation that Dick Morris, the president's friend, relayed in those dark early days. Morris says he took a poll and told Mr. Clinton they'll forgive you the sex, but the country won't forgive you the perjury. And according to Morris, the president replied, well, we're just going to have to win. If that was the case, certainly he's won as far as remaining in office. But I will bet you, and maybe George Stephanopoulos has better insight, but I will bet you that Bill Clinton would be the first to say that there are no winners here. Everyone in this process is sullied. Certainly the president's reputation, perhaps for history as well as contemporaneously. His critics, many of them are in tatters. The press doesn't come out of this smelling, where's Woodward and Bernstein? No heroes here. I think the whole process is one in which there are no winners, and I agree with what's been said, Peter. It's going to be a long time, if ever, for those of us alive, that it's all going to be put back together again.
Well, Sam, I'll certainly say if George Stephanopoulos is sitting beside me that he is nodding affirmation to most of what you had to say. We're joined now by one of the very strong Democratic partisans in this, Senator Torricelli, the Democratic senator from New Jersey, one of the participants on the. Senator, can I just ask you briefly, what were the deliberations like at the very end?
I actually had voted to keep the session open, but I must admit my Republican colleagues who believed that in private session the conversations would be more serious, less partisan, and indeed perhaps more persuasive were probably right. Senators conducted themselves, I thought, very well. Detailed, serious arguments on each side. In a strange way, the Senate was the better for this rather regrettable experience.
Okay, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Just one other question. Do you mean to say that the quality of debate and the nature of debate was that much different in private than it was in public?
I think it was, and that the senators were more willing to concede points to the other side, more willing to look for middle ground. Indeed, I dare say that what was significant about this vote today is that a majority of the Senate did not vote to remove Bill Clinton from office, and that was very important for the legitimacy of this administration for the next 2 years. And I think the private discussions among senators where we're able to find some middle ground was very important in some of those moderate Republicans feeling comfortable on the merits in voting to acquit the president.
On the other hand, Senator Torricelli, and I don't think either one of us want to take it that much further, you're suggesting that we all had to endure quite a amount of public posturing by all of you and when you were not behind closed doors.
That may go without saying. That's part of our culture and part of the business.
Thank you very much for joining us, Senator Robert Torricelli, Democrat of New Jersey. Cokie Roberts, final thought from you up there on the Hill?
Well, as we speak, Peter, a censure resolution is being introduced on the Senate floor, so it does continue to go on. It's not likely to be passed. But what we just saw on the floor was a big round of congratulations for the two leaders. And I think that Senator Torricelli has put his finger on it. Even though the presidency, the House of Representatives, and perhaps the press have come out of this badly, the Senate has actually come out of it a friendlier institution, surprisingly enough.
Let's go back to the chamber for just a second. We won't go through the entire vote here, or at least we won't sit still for the entire vote, but just so that you understand what's happening is that Senator Feinstein of California, Dianne Feinstein of California, has proposed a motion of censure against the president. Senator Feinstein, as much as anybody, has been extremely outspoken on the question of the president's behavior. And while she did not vote to impeach, I've got her words here somewhere, most recently from the Los Angeles Times only yesterday this morning, on how strongly she and others object to the president's personal behavior. And you saw Senator Graham of Texas get up there just a moment ago because he is going to object to this, or they're not going to vote on both of these matters. But Senator Feinstein is one of those who believes, to quote her, that the president's behavior, albeit not worthy of the impeachment, has been shameful, reprehensible, immoral, boorish, reckless, sordid. Those are the Democrats talking about their leader. But let's continue for just a second with some reflection on the impeachment judgment itself. Former Senator George Mitchell is with us briefly today, who's been out and about beating the drums, if I may say, Senator Mitchell, for the president for quite some time, and undoubtedly you're pleased this morning.
Well, I'm pleased at the result, but I'm saddened at the entire process and sad that our country had to go through this and that it's reached this point. But overall, I think the result was entirely predictable. I think there were no surprises in the end.
Now, you spend a lot of your time going and doing the sort of general nonpartisan good work for the country, most notably and most recently is Ireland. Why have you felt the need to be so visible on this particular subject?
I met with the president on several occasions beginning last fall, and I told him that I would do what I could to help for two reasons. One, I believe that this impeachment process was ill-advised from the beginning. I do not think this is a case that should have been brought. I agree with those 5 federal prosecutors who testified before the House Judiciary Committee that no responsible prosecutor would have brought a case of this type. And secondly, of course, I have been a supporter of the president's as majority leader and since in terms of the policies that he has pursued.
Thank you very much. Former Senator George Mitchell, nice to have you, as we've had on several occasions. We're now joined by Senator Robert Bennett of Utah, who voted guilty in both instances here. Right. Your thoughts on what has transpired over the last 5 weeks, and particularly today?
Well, it's been very interesting. The impact on the Senate will be felt for a long time to come.
What do you mean by that, sir?
We've come together in ways that, frankly, we would not have predicted or even imagined 5 weeks ago. We've got a new bipartisan spirit. We have a new acquaintance with each other, being locked in the same room and at least unable to leave for more than a break here and there.
Senator Bennett,
for as many hours as we have. It's been quite an experience.
Can I just interrupt you for a second?
Surely.
Because based on the vote today, it sounds absolutely impossible that you could be in the position you described. Well, the vote today was absolutely party by party, with some very minor and important exceptions. We were all struck here by the fact about how men and women of your caliber in 2 different parties could see the evidence so utterly differently.
Well, if you had listened to the debate, and I know you wish you had, but frankly it would not have been as frank and as open and as direct as it was if it had been opened. If you had listened to the debate, you would see that this turned very narrowly. That is, the agony of, say, an Olympia Snow, who came down on the side of not guilty, of Robert Byrd, who, frankly, for the first part of his speech, led me to believe he was going to vote guilty, and then came down. There are all kinds of reasons, all kinds of reactions here, but we ended up with a tremendous amount of respect for the integrity of each other, for the effort that was put into this. A lot of sleepless nights.
Senator Bennett, I apologize for interrupting you again. I only do it because we have very little time. Do you think the Democratic members of the Senate should now be given political cover, as someone put it, by having a censure vote so that they can go home and campaign saying, well, they really didn't tolerate the president's behavior?
I've been a co-sponsor with Diane, the lead co-sponsor on the Republican side for the censure motion. I don't see it as giving them political cover. This thing is too important to judge a senator solely on the partisan basis. And I think it gives a senator who has decided that it didn't rise to the level of an impeachable crime an opportunity to express himself or herself, including those Republicans who voted to acquit the president, an opportunity to officially make it clear that while they decided not to remove the president, they are more than disappointed in his behavior. To do that in a very formal way, I think, is an important thing, and we're going to end up with 2/3 of the Senate either having voted to convict or to censure. And that, I think, sends a very strong historic message to our children that we need to send.
Senator Bennett, thank you very much indeed. George Stephanopoulos, sitting beside me here, finds that very interesting. Why,
George? It's the first Republican talking point you see. That's that 2/3 have voted either to convict or censure. What they're saying is that no matter what you think, the president's actions are wrong, and they're not going to be hurt going into the future.
Interesting. Let's look at the vote one more time, recap them for you just before we leave here. On the first article of perjury, 55 voted not guilty, 45 voted guilty, and you can see the Republican vote on the right column there. That's the important one, and the Democrats in the center. Article 2, which actually was Article 3 in terms of the entire process, the obstruction of justice, 50-50 right down the middle. While we're looking just briefly at this, let people absorb this one more time. I want to ask Jackie Judd, who's with us in our Washington bureau, what you think, Jackie, from the point of view of the overall investigation of Whitewater the president. Is this over? What can we expect next from Kenneth Starr?
Well, Peter, I think it's very unlikely that Ken Starr would indict Mr. Clinton while he is in office, so that the votes in the Senate today marked more than an end to the congressional process, but I think also an end to any legal jeopardy that Mr. Clinton faces while still in office, and also effectively an end to the investigations, plural, that have dogged him for the past 6 years.
Okay, thanks very much, Jackie. I want to get a final comment from Michael Beschloss as well, who's also with us in Washington. Michael, it was fascinating.
Yeah, it really was fascinating, Peter. And one thing I think we wouldn't have anticipated, and that is that this is really closing with healing. I was so startled to hear that this had bound the Senate together over the last 5 weeks. We had heard so much that this trial might last 6 months, that the Senate would be torn apart, people would have to resign. Those were all sorts of dogs that did not bark, and I think it really augurs well for the chance that you might have the next 2 years of an impeached president with half the Senate voting against him, actually being able to work with the Senate and the House in some state of bipartisanship.
And Jeffrey Toobin, our legal/political analyst. Jeffrey?
Well, you know, the political use of criminal law was something that was pioneered by Democrats in the pursuit of people in the Reagan administration and the pursuit of Newt Gingrich. And here it was adopted, I think, by the Republicans to their chagrin and political disappointment. My hope is that the message here is that we try to keep law and politics separate to an extent that they haven't been.
Very well put, Jeffrey Toobin. In Washington, we're joined briefly by Senator Daschle, Tom Daschle, a minority leader in the Senate. Senator, I'm struck by the fact that a little period of time is a long time in politics, a long time to the next presidential election. You think this is all going to dissipate?
Oh, I think by and large it probably will, Peter. I don't know that with all the issues we have and the national agenda that is out there that this is going to linger. I'm sure that there will be some effort to make it an issue again, but I'm not sure it'll be successful.
Are you looking forward to a Bill Clinton who's going to get in there and compromise with Republicans on issues that he would like to accomplish, that you might want to resist?
Well, I hope that when we compromise, we'll compromise together. I think that we've had a good working partnership over the last several years, and I expect that that will be maintained. There's a lot out there, and we can't pass legislation without good compromise, and we'll look for it where it's available and where we think it makes sense in the country's best interests.
Briefly, if you'll indulge me, Senator, do you think this is an interesting, valuable civics lesson for the country, or just plain tiresome?
Oh, I think it's probably both, Peter. I can't imagine that this is not tiresome for anybody. I think everybody could have had a civics lesson with less than a year and a half of exposure, or whatever length of time it's been. I think for the most part, while it has been a civics lesson, by and large, it's been a burden that we're all glad to be rid of.
Thank you, Senator. You get the last word, at least for this particular broadcast. We appreciate you joining us, Senator Tom Daschle and everybody else. We're going to be back if and when the President makes a statement about this, and we believe he is going to make a statement not very long from now. All of the politicians here, the senators, will want to get back to their constituencies over the presidential weekend here and see how it's played. But you can obviously continue to follow this story and the debate going on even in the Senate now about censure on abcnews.com. We'll have a complete wrap-up on World News Tonight. But before then, we will be back when the President decides he is going to make a comment about this. My thanks, as always, to all my colleagues. I'm Peter Jennings.
This has been a special report from ABC News. The Senate trial of President Clinton. For continuous coverage throughout the day, turn to ABC News and abcnews.com.